Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tearing into John Kerry for meeting with Iranian officials and undermining the Trump administration.
Secretary Kerry can't seem to get off the stage. Stop it. Let it go. You had your day. We think you fundamentally got it wrong with Iran, and we're trying to make it right for America.
Right. Our next guest is taking a step further, sending a letter to the DOJ asking them to investigate whether John Kerry violated federal law. Joining us now is Senator Marco Rubio, Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, what makes you, I think it's inappropriate, it seems, especially because he has an anti-Trump agenda and he makes it clear on every appearance he makes. But what makes you think it might be breaching the law?
The words in the law. There's a thing called the Logan Act. I kind of took quick notes again this morning to make sure I had read it entirely and appropriately because I wanted to bullet point it for you. And basically what it says in the Logan Act is if there's a U.S. citizen that without the authority of the U.S. government is talking to a foreign government with the intent of influencing the conduct of that government or with the intent to defeat a measure of the U.S. government, the Logan Act makes that illegal. Now, we know for a fact, for example, and that Kerry has said himself he's talked to the foreign minister of Iran 3 or 4 times. We've seen reporting that he's been calling foreign heads of state. And we have seen reporting that he has been talking to foreign heads of state and telling them to wait Trump out when it comes to the Iran deal. So when you apply the things that have been reported in the media that we're told we should always believe, and you apply those facts, according to the media, to what we know the law is, that merits an investigation because this is someone who is operating without the authority of the government. He's not a member of Congress, he's not a senator, and he most certainly has not been deputized by the Trump administration to conduct these talks and try to undermine U.S. policy.
Would it be hard to prove intent? You'd have to prove that he was trying to influence them.
Well, obviously, you know, I don't think that he would necessarily deny it. In fact, it seems like he's been bragging about it. He thinks he's doing a heroic thing, but he's violating the law if that's what he's doing. So ultimately, this needs to be looked at because not only should there be consequences if he's in fact done it, but the precedent that this sets is disturbing. You cannot here on moving forward have in the future Mike Pompeo, for example, undermining a Democratic president's foreign policy without authority. So these are the kinds of things that need to be dealt with because not just what happened, but the precedent it sets for the future.
Now, keep in mind, he did bring this up this was brought up to him last night, and he said, well, listen, Henry Kissinger has met with every world leader for the last 2 or 3 decades. What's your answer to that?
Well, no one said it's not illegal to meet with heads of state from other countries. What is illegal is a concerted effort to use that to undermine the foreign policy of the United States. If he is in fact meeting with these leaders and working with them and others to figure out how to undermine U.S. foreign policy or encouraging them to wait out the United States and so forth, then he's violating the Logan Act. So meeting is one thing. Carrying out with the intent of undermining U.S. foreign policy, according to the Logan Act, that's a violation of the law.
And the last famous American who is accused of violating the Logan Act, Mike Flynn. What happened to him? Meanwhile, Senator, let's talk a little bit about this. It sounds as if Charles Grassley has given Dr. Christine Ford's lawyers until tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning to let them know whether or not she's going to show up to testify against, essentially, Brett Kavanaugh on Monday. It sounded like when she was writing in the Washington Post last weekend, she wanted to tell her story. Why do you think she is now balking at coming before Congress to tell that story?
Well, obviously, I don't know. One could speculate that that's a very uncomfortable position to be in, and I understand that. And here's my point. This information emerged probably later than it should have. It certainly should have been disclosed earlier. It could have been dealt with in a very different way. It was not. So this information was brought before us. I believe that it deserves serious attention and respect. And we should hear from Judge Kavanaugh, too, who has strongly denied it. I encouraged and I wanted the committee under Senator Grassley to provide her an opportunity in a forum she was comfortable in to sort of share this information. And she's been given that opportunity, is my understanding, to either do it publicly or do it privately. But ultimately, if that doesn't happen, number one, she shouldn't be criticized for not doing it. Number two, we can't force her and we shouldn't try to. But then the Senate has to move forward based on the information we have before us. And so ultimately, it's a difficult choice, I imagine, for someone like her to make. But it ultimately, we've got to move forward one way or the other here on this. And I think the important thing from the Senate perspective is that she be provided a professional and respectful and credible platform if she chooses to testify to do so. and it appears that that's been what's offered.
Right.
Ultimately, the decision is hers to make, and that should be respected either way.
If we don't hear from her on Monday or from him in turn, which way, given what you know right now about him, would you vote on the confirmation?
Well, so we can only make votes depending on the information that's before us and that's credible and that can be proven, or that at least, so if ultimately we've seen sort of these allegations that have been out there in the press, but no testimony about it hasn't been presented and no further information has been made available. We've heard his denials, and I imagine that's what we'd hear again on Monday at that hearing. And then based on that information, and not just that, but everything else we know about Judge Kavanaugh, we'll have to make a decision. And I continue to be supportive of his nomination. If there is credible information that emerges that somehow undermines that, I'll let everybody know. And obviously the forum, if there is such information out there, it is the job of the committee to provide a forum for that information to be made available. But you can't force someone to provide that, and so ultimately we'll have to move forward based on what we know, and that is, his years of experience on the bench and 12 years on the circuit court already in D.C. and move forward from there.
Right, and I imagine the vote could take place next week.
We'll see. Thank you.
Yeah, that's what it was scheduled to be. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Trump has said of his Secretary of State, "We are always on the same wavelength." As you'll see in my interview with Mike Pompeo, that's apparent. We began our conversation today discussing Iran and his predecessor John Kerry's wildly destructive communications with the world's largest state sponsor of terror. Here's part one of my interview with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Great to be with you.
Iran in the news. Brian Hook, your special envoy, saying, we want to deal with Iran, but a treaty with Iran. Iranian leaders, no go. They're like, we don't want any dealings with the United States at this point. What's going on?
President Trump's been very clear since the time he was running for office that the arrangement that the previous administration put in place was bad for America, frankly, bad for the world. And so I and Brian are working to get Iran to behave like a normal nation, right? Stop being the world's largest state sponsor of terror. Stop launching missiles through proxies. Stop attacking our embassies and consulates. When we get those basic things in place, President Trump's made very clear. We'd love Iran to rejoin the community of nations, but their revolutionary zeal causes them to be a bad actor, and they need to shape up. And if they do, we'll get it right.
Well, again, you and John Kerry have gone back and forth on this. Former Secretary of State Barack Obama has met 4 times with Iranian leadership. And you guys criticized, saying that's not appropriate given, you can't have a 2-track foreign policy here. But he responded by saying there's nothing unusual, let alone unseemly or inappropriate, about former diplomats meeting with foreign counterparts. Secretary of State Kissinger done it for decades with Russia and China. What is unseemly and unprecedented for the podium of the State Department to be hijacked for political theatrics?
Secretary Kerry can't seem to get off the stage, and you have to. When I'm the former secretary, I'll get off. Every previous former secretary has done that too. It's one thing to meet with your counterpart. It's another thing to do what Secretary Kerry, Wendy Sherman, Ernest Moniz, frankly, the whole gang has done, which is to actively seek to undermine what President Trump is trying to achieve. It's okay to talk with him, but you have to be working for America, working for American foreign policy, and they're not. They're working for the foreign policy that is theirs, not the one that belongs to the United States.
Our own Dana Perino last week had Kerry on, and he did not deny that he wanted to basically tell the Iranians that whether he told the Iran to wait it out for the next administration.
I think everybody in the world is sitting around talking about waiting out President Trump.
At what point does the administration pursue some type of legal action against former Secretary Kerry and others from the former administration?
I'll leave the legal action to others. I'm trying to execute America's foreign policy, and they are not only unhelpful, but they are acting in ways that are harmful to achieving what's best for the American people. And that's my criticism. Stop it. Let it go. You had your day. We think you fundamentally got it wrong with Iran, and we're trying to make it right for America.
And reducing the refugee number, that's caused great consternation. It's another issue that President Trump campaigned on, extreme vetting, security for our country. Down to 30,000 next fiscal year. Bob Menendez, big fan of the administration, called it cruel and short-sighted. Human Rights First, another group. It's an abdication, Mr. Secretary, of our humanity. Your response?
America is the most generous nation in the history of civilization. It always has been, and it continues to be under President Trump. We want to get it right for the American people. We've taken in over 4 million legal permanent residents in the last almost 2 decades now. We continue to take in more people than most countries in the rest of the world. But we got to get the security piece right. We got to make sure that we allow those who are in most trouble, most harm's way, to be taken care of in the best place to take care of them, nearer their own country. Those are not heartless things. Those are things that are kind and caring and decent. It's the way we ought to treat our fellow human beings, and it's what we in the Trump administration are committing to do.
What does this administration say to the Christian refugees who feel, many of them abandoned for many years, predating this administration, in Syria, in Iraq, and beyond? They can't go to these camps because they're afraid of going to the camps. How do we reach them? How do we get some of them into the country?
So it's an important and difficult challenge. We want to bring in all those who are most in trouble and are having the most difficulty in the places in which they reside. Vice President Pence has made this a real priority to ensure that Christians are being treated fairly and equitably in our processes. We've seen some of these issues in these camps. Rest assured that the State Department's working to make sure that Christians are not being mistreated, prosecuted, persecuted, or treated in any way that's unfair as they try to make their way into the United States of America.
The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom lists China and Saudi Arabia, right in one, and I think Saudi Arabia is number 3 of the worst violators of human rights. I was thinking about this yesterday because thinking of the old Soviet Union and President Reagan, who both of us admire so much. We didn't do that really heavily engaged trade with the Soviet Union, not just because of nukes, but because of what they were doing on human rights. So how do we justify this huge trading relationship with Saudi Arabia and China, given how we treat then North Korea and a place like Cuba? It seems like there's selective treatment of human rights violations.
So it's always the case when you're trying to advocate for America's interests that you have to weigh the relative concerns, and it is the case that each country presents its own situation. What I think we've been incredibly consistent on is making sure that we identify, we call out these concerns. I've done it with respect to China. I've done it with respect to every place we find religious minorities being mistreated. We held the first ever religious ministerial in the very room in which we're sitting here. It was quite an occasion. People from nearly every religion and 80 delegations. This administration is taking religious freedom all around the world, in China and other places,
1 million
very
Muslims
seriously.
in China being detained, Christian churches, crosses being smashed, churches driven underground, pastors being imprisoned. And, you know, what we have to talk about, my good friend, President Xi, it's heartbreaking to so many of us who care about religious liberty. And I know this is an administration priority, but what do you do? What leverage do we have with China at this point, other than what we're doing now with trade?
Laura, I'm confident we'll talk about China in other contexts too. It presents a myriad of opportunities, but lots of challenges. You speak of one. This is a non-transparent government. It is still a very centralized government. It treats our intellectual property horribly. It treats its religious minorities horribly. In each of these cases, we have opportunities. You've seen what the president's doing with trade to try and make it fair and reciprocal. What we're asking of China is to behave in a way that if they want to be a power, if they want to be on the global stage, they have to operate in the way that global leaders have for so often. And frankly, as you'd point out in the religious dimension, they've not done that.
We talk a lot about this big tech and the relationship between big tech and this administration, whether it's adversarial. But Google specifically in China, assisting Google in developing an app to further censor free expression and the ability of Chinese citizens to get information. Any thoughts on that? How a U.S. company, obviously huge global company too, assists China in that oppression of free expression?
Laura, it is personally and professionally troubling to me when American companies behave one way here and another way when they're dealing with China. It gets at the core problem that President Trump is trying to address, which is that China doesn't permit American investors to invest on the same terms that Chinese companies can invest here. Joint ventures, the list is long of the non-reciprocal relationship. And the president's trying to balance that. And when we get that right, when government gets that right, we can then force American companies to behave under that set of rules. I want every company, including global giants, to treat American citizens as well as they treat the governments in some of these despotic regimes.
And yet they hit the administration, President Trump, a couple days after the election. You got Sergey Brin up there. Got brilliant guy, brilliant people, but criticizing this administration's immigration policy when they're assisting despotic, totalitarian, basically, obviously communist regimes overseas. But Trump's the threat?
I think we have American foreign policy on the right track on each of the dimensions that you're describing, and when we get it right, when we ultimately see the end result of President Trump's efforts, I think you'll see many of these things in a place that America has not seen before.